Right, thank you very much for such an interesting presentation on a really fascinating paper. I very much enjoyed this paper. I've got here just a few comments about some of my key takeaways and some areas that might be interesting for further discussion. So the paper takes a novel approach to answering two very big questions. So firstly, as we've just heard, how relaxing international migration restrictions would affect aggregate welfare and the global distribution of economic activity across the globe over time. Secondly, which there was less time for in the presentation, what the impact of sea level rise would be under different scenarios for the level of migration restrictions. And the paper's key findings, firstly, as we've heard, that relaxing migration restrictions leads to large aggregate welfare gains, both upon impact and in terms of the growth rate on the balanced growth path. And importantly, that it also shifts the locus of economic activity in the future broadly towards what are today's developed economies. The second part of the paper, some of the key findings there were that sea level rise results in large present value welfare losses, but that interestingly these welfare losses have only a very weak relationship with the level of migration restrictions as described in the paper. So this paper takes a very innovative approach to studying the interaction of geography and factor mobility for the future development path of the world economy. And in particular, it tackles what the literature has referred to as the hard problem of regional economics, namely formulating a dynamic model of the growth process with spatial heterogeneity. This paper builds on the significant theoretical contribution of the author's previous work and applies this to what are quite clearly a very topical, very important set of empirical questions. So, as we've just heard and seen in some of the simulations here, the empirical exercise itself is hugely impressive in its scopes. There's an enormous range of data, very fine geographical resolution, which is used to simulate the evolution of the entire world economy over 600 years. And finally, the findings of the paper raise a series of very interesting, very policy-relevant questions about both the spatially and the temporally uneven effects of policy, particularly in a world where the geography is changing. So I'm going to focus my comments on three specific areas that I thought might be interesting for further discussion. The first, perhaps inevitably, and it's received a lot of attention in earlier presentations, is the treatment and the understanding of this fundamental amenities term. The second is some discussion of how we interpret the migration restrictions as they're modelled here, and in particular how they might interact with the non-legal barriers to migration. And finally, I just have a few questions, discussion points about the particular choice of sea level scenarios considered. So, turning to the first of these, the fundamental amenities term, which is to say, as we saw in the setup of the model, the amenities term without the congestion, the term in population density representing congestion spillovers. The fundamental amenities term in each region is treated as an exogenous locational characteristics that's time invariant. And as briefly alluded to in the presentation, this is supported by evidence in the paper that these estimated amenity terms by region are correlated with several common measures of exogenous variables that affect quality of life relating to temperature, precipitation, and so on, geographic and climatic variables. So while this is common in much of the literature, I wonder whether this might present more challenges given the length of time over which you're simulating the model. So two thoughts on this. Firstly, to the extent that this estimated amenities term is indeed capturing these exogenous variables, I wonder how far these might be expected to change over such a long time period during which the climate of the world is projected to undergo significant and, in particular, geographically uneven changes. Secondly, perhaps more fundamentally, is the question of what else this estimated amenities term might be capturing. And to the extent that it's a measure of other things that make locations desirable places to live, whether it might be picking up other characteristics that we might expect to evolve over time. I raise this partly given the very striking figures in the paper about the proportion of the welfare gains coming through this effect that, as you discussed in the presentation, is the reallocation of people from low amenity towards higher amenity countries. I mean, obviously, this figure here is an aggregate figure for the present discounted value of welfare effects, including a lot of the changes that would have happened early on. But certainly a large share of the welfare effects appear to be coming through reallocation from low to high amenity countries, so that we might expect a different treatment of these amenity terms could potentially have significant effects on the estimated welfare gains. As has been discussed, I mean, endogenizing this amenities term is a complex task, but I wonder whether the data that you have might help to at least sort of shed some light on, give some preliminary evidence on the potential importance of these factors. So, I mean, whether it's possible to say something about how much of, what sort of a share of these estimated amenity terms can be explained by these geographic and climatic variables, to what extent your results are sensitive to allowing for projected, at least in, for instance, the temperature and precipitation variables as projected by climate models. I mean, the more direct test of this assumption is clearly whether it would be possible to conduct this estimation over 2 time periods. I mean, clearly data constraints will limit the time span over which this sort of an exercise is likely to be possible. Perhaps in your context, the subjective well-being data is likely to be the major constraint there. But even over the sort of decades worth of Gallup World Poll data that's there, it might be interesting to have some sense of how far these things are changing over time. My second comment relates to the treatment of international migration restrictions in the paper. So the paper models international migration restrictions as a quota that adjusts to keep relative utility levels across countries constant over time. And the exercise to quantify the gains from relaxing migration restrictions consider firstly the case of full liberalisation, as described in the baseline figures refer to this, is the case where you simply allow agents to move freely across as well as within countries such that utility is equalised across all locations. There's then, and there wasn't time in the presentation to describe these, but there's also an analysis of some partial liberalisation scenarios where the exercise is effectively to take the parameter that relates utility in the model and the subjective well-being data and assign it an intermediate value between the value it takes under baseline migration restrictions and under free mobility. And this is used to represent partial liberalisation of migration restriction scenarios, but importantly, these keep fixed the ranking of migration restrictions as revealed by the subjective well-being data. It would seem that this treatment of the migration costs could tend to abstract from differences in the long non-legal barriers to migration, in the sense that, as we've heard earlier today, and here are some other references in the literature to the fact that the physical and the psychic costs of migration are seen to play a significant role and to drive a utility wedge across locations, even in the absence of legal barriers. And what's not clear to me, I'm not sure if there's evidence available on this in your data, but it's not clear that we should necessarily expect these non-legal barriers to preserve the ranking of migration restrictions as observed in the aggregate migration restrictions at baseline, incorporating both the legal and the non-legal migration costs. So if we were to think about a counterfactual scenario where, for instance, non-legal migration barriers were removed, whilst keeping the physical and the psychic costs of migration, it's not clear to me that that exercise would necessarily preserve the ranking of migration restrictions at baseline. So I'd be interested to understand more about how you see non-legal migration costs fitting into your framework and how the potential impacts this might have for your results. Finally, there wasn't much time to get to this in the main presentation, but to give some sense, the paper analyses several sorts of scenarios for sea level rise. So the first part of that analysis looks at the static costs of sea level rise, either of 6 metres or of 1 metre, occurring in period 1 or period 100 or period 500. And then the bulk of the analysis turns to the dynamic effects of those same sea level rises happening between period 0 and period 1. And what that scenario allows you to do is then to look at some of the very interesting dynamic effects that result from this shock to the world's geography under different scenarios for the level of migration restrictions. But as you also highlight elsewhere in the paper, I think the sort of current baseline projections are that sea levels are likely to rise much more gradually than that, something of the order of 0.5 to 1 metre over the next century, and that's likely to be a gradual change which would presumably affect the dynamic responses that we'd expect relative to the case of a one-time shock happening in the first period, before the first period, and therefore the present value welfare losses that we'd expect to result as a result of that. So I'd again be very interested in whether you've also run the simulations in the sort of in the scenarios more aligned with the current projections of climate models, and if so, what the differential results are there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I mean, it's really interesting. So, I think it's related to maybe this related to climate change. Given that I assume, like, I mean, average temperature is one amenity or something that enters in A in the model, you can sort of take those projections and those you can have a gradual and with a lot of. I mean, it's not going to be a 0-1 thing like the flood.
Yes. So actually, you know, this maybe ties in with Clare's comment. Well, by the way, thank you very much for your discussion. So let me just, while the mic goes round, react very briefly to what you said and to Sebastian's comment as well. On the issue of amenities, we keep them constant forever. The two possible criticisms are, you know, there's obviously, you know, public services, etc., that can be changing over time. We think of that as being more captured by a place's real income, so we're not terribly worried about that, in the sense that if real income goes up, these types of amenities will also improve over time. But you're absolutely right that, you know, and that's, I guess, also Sebastian's comment, that if places' temperature changes and other types of things change over time, and there's projections of that, then those those exogenous amenities will be changing over time. And if we have data on those, it's actually a small step to incorporate those data into the model and to incorporate the fact that, you know, some places will get warmer and how will that affect the amenities of those places. Your other comment about legal or non-legal barriers, I absolutely agree. You know, there's ways, I think, of distinguishing between legal and non-legal. In the paper of Dauquier that you mentioned, he looks at the difference between how much migration there is between two countries and the desired migration, and by kind of exploiting the difference between how much actual migration and how much desired migration, you may be able to get some estimate of what the legal barrier is. So take that legal barrier away, and you will still get a non-legal barrier. To the question of the gradual increase in sea levels, the only reason why for now we haven't really done that is because we didn't really have data on exactly the pace of the increase in the sea level. There's also another interesting issue, which is that the sea level won't increase in level everywhere at the same rate. And so now, you know, in the next project, we're teaming up with some climate scientists that actually have those data, so that we can feed in much more precise data rather than saying, oh, suddenly I get a shock of 1 meter or I get a shock of 6 meters. So we'll do that. We'll do that in the future.
Did your question get answered? Yeah.
So a key sort of one of the key striking results is this sort of reversal of fortune, that, you know, in the no migration scenario, Africa is at some point going to overtake us and become the new center of economic activity. If you sort of took this model and sort of calibrated that on data for 1400, let's say, and tried to simulate what happened the next 600 years, would you be able to predict the current sort of distribution of economic outcome? Or so that's just two questions. One is sort of, if you sort of did this on, let's say, the Middle Ages and then predicted today, would the mechanisms of the model be able to sort of predict the growth path that we've seen?
Yeah. I mean, that's
or
obviously
any other sort of evidence on this kind of tight link between that you're putting in here between density and future productivity?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. One, we don't really, there's data on population distribution going back in time, so we could use that. Detailed data on productivity would be harder to get by. So I don't know, I'd love to do it, I don't know how feasible it is to do. And then the other thing which I probably would worry about a little bit is that, of course, you know, if you think about a more standard Malthusian growth model versus sort of more modern growth model, the dynamics may be a little bit different. But maybe one could simply adjust the model and think about a model like this in a Malthusian world and focus mostly on population and use that as a measure and see whether we can replicate something in the pre-modern, let's say in the pre-industrial revolution era. It could be interesting.
Yes, the work you presented is immensely ambitious and, at least to my mind, completely bonkers. If I can pick it apart, starting with East Africa, your map showed East Africa as being apparently relatively high density. It's about 1 person per square kilometre. This is not very high, it's not very conducive to agglomeration. And even though population is growing around 3% per annum, it'll be a long time before places like Dodoma, the dusty plain, drought-prone, cattle scattered around, is going to be very attractive to people coming from elsewhere. This links up with the point that's been mentioned, the relationship which you have between density and productivity. It seems to have no basis whatsoever. So I find myself extremely sceptical about the whole thing. Possibly with a lot of changes, the idea of using 1 degree squares and trying to work out something about the future of the world is a worthwhile exercise, but I'm far from convinced that what you've done is of any value to anyone.
Well, you know, I mean the way I think about it is, first of all, this relation or the correlation that exists today between productivity and density is whatever it is. I mean, this is not something we made up, right? So that correlation is the one. Say again.
1 guy per square kilometre doesn't do anything for agglomeration.
What exactly do you mean? Well, what's your point? I honestly don't understand your point.
It's a very low number.
So, I'm just saying that if you take the world today and you run a correlation between population density and income per capita, you get this correlation of -0.4. Whether you like that or not, that's what the data says. And then using those data, you know, you can come up with a framework to try to see how this will evolve over time. And there may be obviously aspects, so this is something I just want to emphasize, there's definitely aspects, and I would be the first one to admit that, there's many aspects that can be improved in what we're doing, there's many aspects that should be improved in what we're doing, but at the same time, the sort of name of the game is the following. We are, as economists, interested in, for example, understanding how climate change will affect the world's economic geography, and at the very least, that we should all agree that we need a framework to do that. And you can say, I don't need a framework, I'm just going to do some hand-waving, and I'm going to do what the IPCC does and say, well, what if there's a scenario that the poor countries converge with the rich countries, then this will happen. But you know, you need some kind of framework to start with, you need some kind of theory, and that's, in some sense, we've proposed a theory that can do this. It's tractable, it's solvable, there's data out there that can be used to estimate it and to run the model, but the data can be improved and will be improved in the future. The framework itself, given that it's solvable and tractable, could be made more complicated, right? More details could be added into it. And if, say, you have some particular aspects that you object to and that you have a very clear reason of why you think that's bunkers, you know, we can change that. So it's not that, you know, we don't want to sell this as saying, oh, here we have a model of the whole world economy and of the world economic geography, and this is the truth, and we can all, you know, pack up our bags and, you know, and check out. So this is a first step in a much broader research agenda. And I think some of the comments Claire made, for example, of using better data, of doing things in a more precise manner, of maybe using other microestimates to parameterize things. Sure, but you have to kind of start somewhere. And the point I would want to push is that without a framework and without a model, then we're just sort of having a coffee table conversation, and that's the thing we want to shy away from.
If no one else. I want to understand something. So suppose you study in period 1, right? And there's no mobility, and you allow for mobility, free mobility. So at the beginning, right, in the places where people is moving, wages goes down. So people in those areas are worse at the beginning.
Yes.
Maybe in the long run
Yes.
they get better.
Yes.
Okay.
No, actually, I actually very much like this point. So if you think about we haven't shown this here, but if you liberalize migration restrictions, there will be short-run losses in these richer areas, right? So if you say, oh, I want to assure that, say, the US or Western Europe stays in the lead, in the short run there's going to be losses. In the long run there's going to be gains, and it turns out that the long run gains actually compensate the short run losses, so that in the long run everybody, even at present discounted value, everybody ends up gaining, but there would be definitely short run losses. That's important.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.